Darren, some of the best and largest apps I've ever made are with WinForms. And as great as the platform is, the problem is when I want to embrace new awesome features, they're not always shipping fast enough in the .NET framework.
Yeah, the .NET framework has to support billions of users. And so it's necessary to make sure that all the testing's done to make sure you don't break significant portions of that.
That's a slow cadence that they're in. And what I'd really like to do is take the .NET framework and just ship it with my application so I could have whatever feature I want.
So take a core set of capabilities.
Like a core of the .NET and ship it. It's .NET Core with WinForms, this episode of Dev Radio. Hey, and welcome to the next episode of Dev Radio. I'm Jerry. I'm here with Darren. Hi, Darren.
Hey, Jerry.
Darren, I've got a test for you. You want to take a quiz?
Oh, go for it.
All right. True or false? Microsoft hires more attorneys than developers.
False.
That's true. Of course it's not. True or false? Developers who open up Visual Studio, the most likely type of project to be opened is WinForms.
True.
True is correct. And we've got some changes coming to WinForms, and it's pretty exciting. We've got Ricardo. He's a senior program manager with Visual Studio. He's taking care of everything, and he's going to talk us through what is the most popular project type in Visual Studio. Unbelievable. Ricardo, thanks for being on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Now, Ricardo, tell us who Ricardo is.
Okay, so I'm a PM working in Visual Studio, and I'm focused on all the tools and experiences for creating Windows applications, from WinForms, WPF, SAML, UWP, all kind of project types, and also the design experiences from the SAML language service, things like IntelliSense, and the SAML designer as well, and how to deploy these applications to different kind of devices.
Holy moly, we got
that's widespread.
Yeah.
I think we're going to book you for more episodes.
Yeah, wow. You got an easy job in there.
Well,
just a little bit.
But all right, let's prune it down a little bit. As much as I want to talk to you only about XAML, I want to start by talking to you specifically about, well, really not just WinForms, but like this whole .NET Core thing that is happening to all the client technologies that we have. Kind of walk us through the new Microsoft.
All right, sure. So before that, let me talk a little bit about how we see the Windows desktop landscape right now. And as you said before, we saw a lot of WinForms developers in the Visual Studio telemetry. It looks like WinForms is still a huge thing for .NET developers. And the reason for that probably is because it's super easy to get started. So if you want to create some UI, create the WinForms, drag and drop some controls, double click, you have the event handler, and it's the easiest thing to get started. And also in the past years, maybe 5 to 7 years, the different technologies that Microsoft created for Windows development were not so popular. So we have some issues with Windows 8 era, we have some problem with Windows Phone, we also have Silverlight, so there were a lot of attempts to trying to modernize the
3 in a row,
how
thanks.
to create applications. No, I'm trying to be very honest here. So last year we were looking at the data, talking with users, talking with customers, and everyone was asking, hey, why don't do something for the technologies that we care most, that are WinForms, WPF, and creating beautiful applications for Windows. So we have UWP. UWP is great for creating applications for different kind of form factors and devices, but for desktop there are still some use cases that are not very well solved with UWP. So that's one reason. And the other problem is that anyone wants to build their application from scratch. And moving to UWP means to start from the beginning. Mm-hmm. So we were looking at how can we change all of these technologies, and how can we make Windows desktop developers excited again about the technology that we have. That's on one hand. On the other hand, we have .NET Core. That's the modern version of .NET that is open source, that is cross-platform, that we released two major versions, 1.0, 2.0. Now we are in 2.1 and very close to the 2.2 release. It's phenomenal for server scenarios, and we want to have this technology available for desktop developers as well. So we were thinking, hey, what if we enable WinForms and WPF in .NET Core? How it will look like? So we started prototyping some months ago, and in Build, it was at Build 2018, we announced this big thing that we are bringing WinForms and WPF to .NET Core. So that's kind of the history of why we are here right now. We have not released the final version yet. We are targeting sometime next year, summer 2019. And we released the preview one at Connect recently, and this is the first official preview release of .NET Core 3 with support to WinForms and WPF. So the next question is, why should I move to WinForms or WPF to .NET Core 3?
We'll be asking the questions, Ricardo.
Yeah, you've stolen our sheet.
Why should I be moving to .NET Core, Ricardo? I've been wanting to ask that.
Before answering that question, I want to make it very clear that we are still support .NET Framework. .NET Framework is a great platform to develop Windows desktop applications. But you need to understand that there are more than 1 billion machines running .NET Framework, and making any changes to that code base is extremely expensive and super risky. So every time that we release something or try to fix one bug, maybe we are affecting other customers that something it's not working as they expect. So we are very sensitive to how to make changes to the .NET Framework. So if you are in a sustain mode, your application has been running for years in .NET Framework, you are safe running on .NET Framework. .NET Framework is a Windows component. It's going to be there forever as long as Windows is supported. So we will support .NET Framework as long as Windows, and all the applications that are there are great. However, if you want to modernize your application, and we will talk more what it means modernize, if you want to take the latest features of .NET, things like C#8, and you are making active investments in your app, probably moving to .NET Core, it's a great idea. So think this like, if you have an application that is stable, that you maintain for years, you can stay there forever. If you want to modernize your application and make some new investments in the UI, in how do you deploy your app, integrating with Windows 10, things like that, then .NET Core is also a great option. Make sense?
Wait, let me ask you about .NET Core as a great option. For who? How does a developer know if they're safe to migrate over?
So now we can start talking about the migration. So if you want to migrate your application, we are trying to make everything as compatible as possible, but it's not 100%. We have a tool that is called the API Port Analysis Tool that will scan your assemblies looking for types that are not supported in .NET Core 3. Some examples that we always use. So for example, remoting is not going to be in .NET Core 3. It's not only for desktop, it's also for server-side scenarios, so no remoting. There are multiple reasons from security, performance, and how the industry has evolved since we launched .NET 20 years ago. For example, GAG assemblies. There's no GAG in .NET Core. That also affects things like app domains. We have one app domain by default, but what is not supported is to create an additional app domains. And there are also some minor things that we are exploring right now to bring to .NET Core. So in this version, we don't have support for OLEDB, but we are talking to customers and getting feedback. So one thing that I like to ask you, or ask anyone who's listening to this podcast, is if you can try .NET Core 3, do it as soon as possible. Let's see if there are any types that you miss and you think that should be there, because we are hearing customers to decide which APIs will be there for .NET Core 3 or not.
Cool.
So don't think that this is the final list. So this is just the list that we are exploring. There are some things that we are adding to the set of APIs that will be supported, and others that we can't for different reasons.
So I think this kind of leads on to a quick clarification around perhaps what is .NET Core versus .NET Standard, because some of these things talk to facilities that may or may not be available cross-platform. So if you could help clarify that a little bit, it would be great.
So .NET is a family of different products, technologies, and there's one important concept in .NET that is the platform or the runtime, who's running your code. So we have different runtimes. One popular runtime is .NET Framework, of course. It was like the very first .NET runtime. We also have Xamarin, that is the runtime that is used for running .NET code on your mobile phones. And now .NET Core, that is another runtime or platform to execute .NET code. But not all the platforms share the exact same APIs. We tried to solve this problem with portable class libraries some years ago, but the experience was, well, we have some good things, but it was very tricky to know which platform do you want to target, and have the developer experience was not so great. So we announced .NET Standard 2 years ago. Now we are in .NET Standard 2.0. So .NET Standard is a specification that all platforms that support that version of .NET Standard should implement. So when you are creating a .NET Standard library, what it means is that it's safe to say that that library will run on any platform who implements that version of the standard. One of the greatest examples that I hear about how to understand .NET Standard is that .NET Standard is the like HTML, the specification of HTML, and the runtimes are like the browsers who understand that version of the HTML. So HTML5 is one standard, and you have different browsers who understand that standard. Think in the same way to .NET Standard and .NET Framework or .NET Core. So .NET Standard 2.0, it's one of the major releases that we have with .NET Standard. There's another one that is coming, is .NET Standard 2.1. But in 2.0, any library that supports 2.0 can be safely consumed from .NET Framework, .NET Core, or Xamarin runtimes.
So then to follow on, if WinForms and WPF are coming to .NET Core, are they also coming to .NET Standard? And I think
no.
The
answer is no. The answer is no. One of the things that we don't have in .NET Standard are any UI APIs. So all the APIs that are there, lack of any kind of UI. And of course, Xamarin has a different UI characteristics like .NET Framework. So creating a .NET Core 3 application doesn't mean that that application implements the .NET Standard. So you can consume .NET Standard libraries. You can create .NET Core libraries that have some WinForms on WPF, but those libraries can be used in other platforms that support .NET Standard. So
according to all the newspaper magazines, by the time we get to Standard 10, we're going to have all the UI in. I'm just kidding. Never mind.
That fell.
So if I'm a developer, I'm trying to convince my manager that we need to move this over to .NET Core. It's going to be a timeline. It's going to be a cost. There's going to be some effort involved. One of the reasons is because I'll be able to ship my own version of .NET, and so I don't have to worry about contaminating or any sort of issue like that. So it's really great. I can use whatever version I want, not worry about what's installed ahead of time. And what are some other reasons that I might be tempted for? Is there a performance impact?
Well, I think it's too early to know how will be the performance impact. The thing that we can say is that we are in a better position to improve the performance of these kind of applications. In the same way that we improved the performance of .NET Core 2.2, and it was something that we got by changing things in the very low-level types. So things like a span of T and how to handle with memory, things like that. And it's not only adding those types, it's how to consume those types from the base class library. That's something that was super risky of doing in .NET Framework. Now with .NET Core, we are in a different position because you can deploy your application targeting 3.0, and we can deploy another application in the same machine targeting 3.1, who will take care of the new performance features. So I think that it's too early to make any promise of what kind of performance you will see. Probably depends on your application, how are you dealing with your application, but we are in a better position to make those performance improvements happen.
If you're creating it today, so I use Visual Studio 2017 today. Obviously, 2019 is on its way. Is this a capability that developers using 2017 have, or do they need to wait until they go to 19?
Okay. The official support for .NET Core 3 desktop development will be in 2019 only. Okay. You can open in 2017 update 9. But there are some caveats. So, for example, we don't have designer support. We will talk about the developer experience in a second. But let me go back to trying to answer more reasons to why migrate to .NET.
Oh, yeah, great.
I didn't answer all the different options. So, as you mentioned, the app local and side-by-side are very important ones. When we say side-by-side, we mean that you can have different versions of .NET Core runtime installed on your machine, and you can decide which application will target which version of the .NET runtime. Remember that today, in your machine, you only have one copy of .NET Framework. Every time you upgrade .NET Framework, all the apps will run on that version of .NET Framework.
I actually have an anecdote from that. You and I, we both used to do office development, smart docs and all those things.
Oh, yeah.
And we used to run into a lot of problems back in that day where you would build a .NET assembly that would plug into, say, Excel, that would give smart capabilities. That was tied to a specific version of the runtime. If they had a different version of the runtime installed on the machine, it would spool up whatever version you were attached to, and then you could never run anything else. So, yes. The importance of that in the enterprise is enormous.
Yeah, it's not DLL hell, it's more like .NET hell in that case.
Yeah, so that's one thing that it's enabled with .NET Core. And the next thing is app local. App local means that all your dependencies are inside one folder, so you can share that folder and the application just run. So remember, when you create your installer for your desktop application, you want to check if the version of .NET Framework that you are using is already installed. If not, the user needs to install .NET Framework, and then they can get into your application. Here, everything is self-contained. So of course, it's the size of the folder is greater than if it's framework dependent. But it's not so great. So I think that the latest build is about 80 megs or something like that, and you will have the runtime, the garbage collector, the JIT, everything that is needed to run .NET Framework applications, and also all the base class library will be there in only 8 megs.
So basically, you could run it off a USB stick.
That's what I was going to say, yeah.
Exactly. And also in Win 7, Win 8, any version of Windows. So we are supporting Win 7 Service Pack 1, and you can run that application anywhere. Yep. So that's kind of the big improvements from the runtime point of view. From the developer experience, there are also some improvements. So now we are using the newest CSproj format, the file format for the Visual Studio project file that is using the what we call SDK style projects. It's a very simplified version of the CSproj. I'm going to demo that in a second so you can see which are the different benefits. And it's more aligned with how modern development looks in Visual Studio. And finally, the last thing that will be available in .NET Core 3 is the freedom to choose which versions or which UI platforms do you want to use. We are talking about WinForms, WPF. We also have the UWP UI, and now you can mix and match in the same application the three technologies as you want. So you can have some parts of your application, like the shell can be WPF, then you can have like a pane that it's WinForms, and you can modernize your application adding some piece of UWP to it if you want.
Is that the XAML Island approach?
Exactly. That's the idea of the XAML Island. So you can host UWP content in traditional desktop applications. So the whole idea of all of this in desktop development is that we don't want to force you to go to one technology or the other. This is more a la carte approach. So you choose what you want to use. If you are starting from an existing application, you don't want to rebuild from scratch, or you want to reuse all the things that you have and then adding some some screen, some UI, something that you want to add. Maybe you want to modernize the deployment using app local. That's also another great example of modernization. Maybe you want to use MSIX, or you want to explore and distributing your application through the store, or doing side loading. So all of these options are things that you can add to your application instead of saying, hey, I need to start from scratch creating a new app because I want to take benefit of this specific feature. So now you can use the feature that you want for your desktop development.
So it is an MSIX experience, so I still have the identity with the store if I want to use some of the advanced capabilities that are kind of signature to Windows 10.
In the preview one that we released recently, there is no support for MSIX yet, but in the preview 2, we are looking to have some deployment story about MSIX. Yep.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So yeah, MSIX is not only the way to deploy packets to the store, it's the future of deployment technologies on Windows for the store and non-store scenarios as well. And we want to make sure that Visual Studio will help you to produce these kind of packages that are easily shared across your organization, your enterprise, to your users. Or if you are targeting consumers, probably the store is a great place, but we don't want to have different deployment technologies. So it's one deployment technology for all of your needs.
Sweet. Wow, that's a great story.
So you touched on a little bit about the developer experience earlier on. I recently wrote a course on modernizing a WinForm application by leveraging some of the newer HTTP capabilities instead of ASMX and so on. And one of the things I noticed was that the designer in Visual Studio 2017 did not support high DPI very well. I had to run Visual Studio in a specific mode, which switched off all the high DPI capability. It was like Mr. Blurry Cam looking at Visual Studio whilst I laid out my UI. I did notice some of the manifest stuff automatically had the high DPI capabilities turned on. So once my app was running, it looked good, but the development wasn't so great. Is that evolving as part of this process?
Okay, so there are two parts here. One is how Visual Studio works with high DPI. It's something that we are improving over time. But again, Visual Studio runs on top of .NET Framework, and there are some changes in .NET Framework that are very risky to make. So we try to improve high DPI, and we know that we are not done yet, but we have some improvements in high DPI based on the latest version of .NET Framework. Now, if you want to create your application and you want to make sure that your application scales properly with high DPI scenarios, that's something that .NET Core will allow us to make more changes to the runtime and making sure that that experience will be better. Again, because we can say that maybe in 3.1 there is full high DPI support, and if you want to target 3.1, that's okay, because we are not going to break anyone targeting 3.0. So that's probably one of the first things that we will tackle in the list once we release 3.0. But there are high DPI fixes in 3.0 as well. Yeah.
So let's stick to this developer experience here. This is my favorite part of the conversation. Maybe you could give us a demo.
Yeah, sure. And then we can talk about how is the developer experience. So let me share my screen.
Okay, Ricardo, I can totally see your screen.
Perfect. So here what I have is a command prompt. The reason that I'm going to start my demo with the command prompt is that we don't have the templates available in Visual Studio, and the experience will be very similar to any .NET Core development from the command prompt. So let's first of all let's see which version I have here. So I have Microsoft Windows Desktop App 3.0. Here's where all the bits for WinForms and WPF are available. And so now if I want to create a new application, you will see that we have these two new templates, WPF and WinForms. Let's start with WinForms. So I can do .NET new WinForms. And my output folder will be my WinForms app.
Nice, classic.
Yeah. So now I can move to this directory. You will see that there are CSprot, form, but before doing anything else, just let's run the application, .NET Run. This is building the app and running the application with .NET Core. Let's see, here we go. And now you will see
to get started in WinForms.
Yeah, so some things that are different for technical people, not users. Users won't see any difference. Is where is this application running? So if I go to my task manager and I see my WinForms app, and I go to details, you will see that this is running in an exe file that looks exactly as any other exe file. But when we open the location of this application, you will see that I have these new files here, the runtime and devs and things like that. That means that this is running under .NET Core. If we take a look at with the debugger and which DLLs are loaded, you will see that this is not using anything from .NET Framework. But this is very rough experience, so let's go to Visual Studio and see how can we use this application from Visual Studio. So now I'm going to run the latest and greatest Visual Studio 2019. And you will see the new experience on how to start. So I want to open an application from an existing folder. This is the application that I want to load. And here in the new Visual Studio, you will see some new details, like the menus are now in the title bar, so you have more space. We move the search here. We have live share by default. So it's a very similar experience, but it's...
now, where's the option to switch all the menu text to uppercase?
I think that it should be here as well.
Just search for Windows 8.
Yeah, I think it's in somewhere.
No, it's not really.
Okay, and anyway, so this is my WinForms application. So the first thing that you will notice is that there is no designer support, and there's something that we are working on that, but in the preview one, we don't have designer support. I will show you some workarounds to work with the designer. But now let's see what's new. So the first thing is the CS Proj. You will see that this is the project file for the new
some mistake. You've opened up something else.
Something small. You've opened up something small.
Yeah. Everything is here. So so first thing, here in the SDK, you will notice that we have this Windows desktop thing. This means that the project system knows that, and also the compiler, that this is a CS Proj that is using WinForms or WPF. If you want to use WinForms, you need to specify this property, use WinForms true. We have another property for WPF. And that's basically it. So now I can F5, debug my application. This is the same application that we saw before. But now, if we go and see the modules that are loaded here, you will see that all the DLLs, like system runtime or all the basic DLLs, comes from these folders that are not the .NET Framework folder. And this is because this application is using .NET Core instead of .NET Framework. So now we can do things like app local and etc. How can I enable app local in this application? So we have this publish experience here, where you can create your publishing profile. Let's create the profile before publishing. So I can show you how to customize this publishing profile. And here in configure, you can choose if you want a framework dependent or you want a self-contained application. When I create a self-contained application, I need to specify which target runtime I want to use. Let's say that I want Win x86. I can save. I can hit publish, and now I will have a version of this application with all the dependencies in the same folder. So now let's go to the output folder while the build completes. Go bin, release, netcore, publish, and here's the folder with all the files that are needed to run my application. I will also have here my WinForms exe that it's here. And
I would install this with Xcopy, basically.
Exactly. So here is the same application running. You can distribute this folder. And now if I'm not going to do that, but if you attach the debugger, you will see that all the DLLs are local to this folder. So this is how you create self-contained applications. But before Going further, you will ask, hey, I'm not able to edit my form if I don't have a designer, especially for WinForms. So one workaround that we recommend is that, again, I want to be very clear that our goal is that we will release the final version with designer support. So this is
Okay.
workaround for the previews. So you can add another project that is also a WinForms application. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to link, I'm going to delete this.
That was a .NET Framework project, just to be clear.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, you're right. This is a .NET Framework project. This is the project we have seen in Visual Studio forever. We have the full designer support. And so the only thing that I'm going to do here is to link files from one project to the other. So I can edit the designer in one project and run the in the project with .NET Framework and run the application in the project with .NET Core.
Okay.
So first of all, to avoid any problems with namespaces or project names, I'm going to set the assembly name and the default namespace of my new project to be the same as my .NET Core project. So if I want to add things or whatever, everything will work. So in that, I'm going to properties. I'm going to set my WinForms app. Okay, and I'm going to delete this form, and I'm going to link the form that it's created in the other project. To do so, I can go to Add Existing Item. And now, instead of adding this file, I can use this Add as a link. And now it's added as a link. What it means that it's the same file open in both projects, but now I have the designer. So let's say that I want to change this label, and I want to change the font, and I can use everything from the designer. So let's say that I want to use Arial, and I want to make it bold. And what else can we do? Let's change
color.
Yeah, sure.
There we go.
Let's use one of the, yeah. So you have here the designer, but now, well, let's say the solution and everything. Oops. No, I think I should choose the same name. But anyway, now I can run my WinForms app. Again, this is based on .NET Core, and I will see all the changes that I made with the designer. So here you have the best of both worlds. So you can create self-contained apps and use all the design time experiences that we have here. There is also another option to solve this problem, and this is one of the most requested clarification that I've heard talking with customers is, can I use existing .NET Framework libraries from .NET Framework projects? And the answer is yes. You can reference .NET Framework libraries. However, it's something that it's somehow risky because not all APIs will be there. This is something that we enable in .NET Core 2.0 to allow existing code to run in the new runtime. So that's another option. What it means that you can have one library targeting .NET Framework. Let's say that I want to add one project here that will be a class library targeting .NET Framework. And let's say that these are my controls. Of course, because this is targeting .NET Framework, I can add here any kind of UI that I want. So let's say that I want to add another form. And here again, I have my designer. And now you can reference this project from my core application.
Mm-hmm. And of course, that also helps because a lot of NuGet packages are still the .NET Framework as opposed to .NET Core.
Exactly. So now,
and has your team done any testing yet on component vendors and whether or not they support this new approach?
Oh yes, we started earlier with the most important control vendors, and so we are talking with DevExpress, Telerik, Infrajustice, Grape City, all of these companies. And one of the first companies that at least they started testing and released something is Infragistics. So our friend Brian Lagunas, hey Brian, if you hear us, he already ported not only Prism, that is a very popular library for creating complex WPF applications, but also he was able to migrate one of their sample apps using Infragistics controls. And he was using the .NET Framework version of Infragistic controls in a .NET Core application.
Cool.
Yep.
Cool. Definitely, Brian.
We know Brian.
What a dork.
Well, that's and we expect that more those companies will first declare support for .NET Core desktop applications, and second, to release specific versions of their controls targeting .NET Core. So cool. Before finishing, let me show how is the experience for WPF. It will be most or less the same, but just to make sure that we also cover some of the scenarios. So I can do .NET new WPF -o my WPF app. And now that it's created, I can add to this project to my solution. Add existing project. It's here, my WPF app. Again, you will see that we don't have designer, but you can do the same trick to enable the designer. But we have what we call the language service. So you will have SAML language support here from Visual Studio. So if you want to do things like foreground, you can expand the properties, have the enumerations, and everything. So even if you don't have designer support, at least the IntelliSense or your default expectations with the SAML language service are already there. So now I'm going to run the same application. I changed the foreground color.
A lot of developers like only without the designer. A lot of XAML developers like to just write the XAML. Yeah.
Yep.
So here it is, and again you will see that this application. So for example, MS Core Lib is loaded from .NET Share Microsoft Framework. So it's not the .NET Framework version, but it's highly compatible with .NET Framework.
Now, when the time comes that I need an API that's not necessarily provided to me from .NET Core, where am I getting the Windows APIs?
Okay, so that's another good question. So as I said before, one of the other reasons for modernizing your application is if you want to use Windows 10 features. So to get the Windows 10 APIs, this is some work that we are working on that right now, is to have a better experience to enable Win 10 APIs. We are exploring to using NuGet packages for that. So the experience will be like adding a NuGet package, and then you will have the Win 10 APIs available here.
That's cool.
And one of those
right
APIs,
now in the preview, you have to manually add, don't you?
Yes. Well, right now, if there's an option to do that, but you need to know where to look in your application, in your program files folder. So you need to add the Windows WinMD. Then you need to add some DLLs for system runtime SAML, and we want to have a better experience for this kind of apps. And also the SAML islands. So if you want to enable SAML islands here, you need to target some Windows Win 10 APIs. Yeah, so that's something that we will add to the next preview.
So, Ricardo, what you were showing us is pretty cool. Are the things that we are accustomed to still there? Like, can I still use WinForms in WPF? Can I still use WPF in WinForms?
Yes, you can mix and match. There will be some limitations, like always, so you can nest forever WinForms inside WPF, inside WinForms, inside WPF, but basic stuff, yes, will be there. So the element host and the WinForms integration will be there. Yep.
Obviously, we're seeing that the designer limitation is here, but that's just because you're showing us so early in the life cycle of this, so we can see what's left.
Remember that this is the preview one, so I'm just showing some workarounds, and well, we finish the work with the designer, also for WinForms and WPF. So both designers will be there by the GA.
I know one thing that would be on the top of every WPF developer's list is, what about the web browser? will you be able to update the web browser, or will...
That's another very good example of how to use SAML Islands. So one of the things that we enable with SAML Islands to reuse the existing modern controls that are available today only for Win10 developers using GWP. So now you can reuse those controls in WinForms and WPF. So we released 4 major controls. One is the web browser. So now you can use the web browser and it will be using the Edge rendering engine instead of IE. We also have another control that detects if you are running Win7 or Win10. So if you are in Win7, it will use the old IE, and if you are running Win10, it will use the newest. Another controls that we have is the ink canvas. So if you want to use some of the new features that we have available for WP developers in ink, you can enable the same in WinForms. And the last 2 are the media player with a smooth streaming and all the goodness from the modern media player. And the last one is the maps control. Yeah, so you can have maps control available in your application. And all of that technology is built on top of SAML Islands. These controls are available for .NET Framework and .NET Core. But if you want to create your own UWP controls and host them, you will need to target .NET Core. That's the idea. Yep.
Okay. I think a lot of developers are pretty excited about all the things that are happening now in not just the framework, not just .NET, but WPF. Everything seems to be coming back to life again. It's exciting.
And what is more exciting is the idea of a la carte that I mentioned before. So let's use the features that really makes more sense for your application. Some developers will modern UI with the latest innovation for Win10 because they don't care about Win7. Other developers will prefer rich and target any kind of Windows device without any dependency for the framework. So the app local is another great story for them. Some developers just want to modernize their projects and solutions, and maybe they are already using .NET Core on the server and they want to use the same stack on the client, so all their solutions will use the new project format. So name it. I mean, if you want to move your application forward and you want to take benefit of the latest innovations in .NET, go to .NET Core and you will see all the...
I do. That's what I want to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, sure.
Exactly.
All right, Ricardo, listen, we know you've got like acres of resources for us. You've got blog articles, samples, code snippets, pots of gold. I mean, everything we could ever imagine. We'll make sure the link to all of those is at the bottom of this episode so everybody can get it. Man, this has been fantastic. Thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.